All right, guys, welcome everybody. I'm here with my friend Alejandro, who's currently on the road going back home, and he's on kind of like a long little trip. How you doing, Alejandro?
I am doing outstanding, having a great day, having a great conversation with a good friend of mine, and looking forward to plumbing the secrets of the universe with you.
Nice, man. Good deal. That'll be something to occupy your time while you're driving. I know that, it can be boring, but hopefully this will occupy you and we'll all have fun and the audience can engage. Like I say, I've got a link up there for joining in case someone a little further into the show wants to jump in and kind of engage with us and ask questions or what have you. We can do that. But
Sure.
yeah, so we were going to talk about kind of like where we picked off from. We were on our group,
Hmm.
Fight on the Fence, and we were talking about grounding. I like to challenge people,
Right.
not necessarily on what they believe, but why they believe it in different angles.
Well, that's
And
perfectly
just
sensible.
just to let everybody know and let you know, I'm not opposed to whatever it is that you believe. Like if you believe in God or you don't believe in God, the only thing I'm interested is in asking certain questions, like how do you connect the dots? How do you get there? What's the grounding on it? And so what I'll do is I'll oftentimes steel man opposite positions just to kind of get that stuff out of you and challenge you, because that's
Sure.
what debates are all about. It's fun. It's like playing chess. So
Absolutely.
so we can get down to it. So I'm going to take a position of um, not necessarily that there is no God in this particular context, because in this conversation we're talking about how we ground our worldview, and so I kind of want to let the audience know what I mean by that, because a lot of people may not understand what I'm asking here. But when I say grounding, it's like a philosophical term, which is like where you rest your premises on. Like if I say I believe the sky is blue, well, what do you ground that on? Well, I ground it on empiricism, like what I'm observing in the real world and what I can kind of confer with other people to see if that's an objective fact. And you can ground it on really pretty much with everything. Like I'll say, could just be the nature of reality. Like that's just how reality is. Reality has certain wavelengths for light. Um, our brain works a certain way so that we decode that information to appear as a color. And so that's the grounding. That's what I mean by grounding, like some sound, objective, concrete way of thinking. And so let's talk about soundness. So in that question was the question originally, just to let everybody know, was what sound, absolute, and primary referent do we appeal to when we make truth claims? Like if we're going to say something's true, are we grounding that in just argumentation, like concepts? Or are we grounding it in something real, like something concrete that we can all agree exists and touch it and measure it and see it and deal with it that way? Doesn't mean that this concrete thing or this object or subjective or imaginary idea doesn't exist necessarily, but just how are we grounding the concept of this thing exists versus this thing does not exist? Like, what is our grounding for saying that? So that's just what I mean. Hopefully that makes sense. And if you have any further questions as we go on, please, you can post it in the comments for more clarification on that. But I'll just turn it over to Alejandro. I'll kind of point the question back at you again. Alejandro is a Zoroastrian, so he's a theist. It's a form of theism. He believes in a supernatural sort of God. And so I would just ask, what is your sound, absolute, primary referent for believing that? Or is this just an opinion? What would you say?
All right. Well, the easiest way for me to explain this, is to start with non-theistic paradigms, go over the problems, and then sort over, and then from that explain why theism. So you've done a very good job expressing how challenging it is to even know what the idea of truth is in a non-theistic paradigm. You expressed, well, basically a version of solipsism that, well, I see blue, therefore blue. Uh, but that, of course, it's the brain in the bucket problem. Like, okay, well, how do you know that's really blue? How do you know the way you see blue is not the way I see red, and vice versa? So this runs square into, like I said, the brain of the bucket problem. And then the brain of the bucket problem goes a level further because outside of theism, how do you even trust your own reason? Your own thoughts are just as controlled as your perception. There's no exception for me thinking 1 + 1 = 2. That could just be, a contrivance. For all we know in the real world, it sometimes doesn't, and we just don't see it. Um, so when you look, so you ask the question, and again, how do we know what is true? Well, again, if there is no God, then you also run into the free will problem, which is a version of the brain in the bucket problem. By that I mean, okay, so how do we choose what we believe? How do we decide, well, I believe Joe Smith will be the best president. Well, I think John Smith will make the best president. Well, where does that decision come from? Where does that idea actually originate? And you are looking for grounding. And without God, we are left with basically three other options, which I can cover in a future date with you. But the big three are solipsism, pantheism, and nihilism. And none of them produce satisfactory results. If nihilism, then really there is no such thing as truth. Unfortunately, that runs into the self-refuting idea, like, well, you're saying it is true that there is no truth, and that leads you right back to contradiction. Some people are just going to accept that. Simply, well, I accept that there's no truth. I accept it's contradiction. I accept it's not logical. And you really can't do much at that. You really can't say, well, if someone's going to say, I'm perfectly comfortable saying things and believing things that don't make sense. You do run into people like that. Then you run into solipsism. And a lot of the stuff you said in your introduction has a solipsistic uh, flavor to it. It says, well, I'm grounding in concrete things. I know my truth is that the world is racist because I experience racism. Well, my personal truth is there's no racism because I don't experience it and I'm not a racist. There's no resolution there. There's no way. And so the problem there that crops up is when solipsists want to be chief god. So someone can be like, well, my personal truth is that I'm really a woman. And, well, if it's your personal truth, it's not grounded in anything other than your opinion. So as soon as you tell someone, no, you're wrong, you argued against solipsism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, Finally, you have pantheism. And of course, pantheism, the ultimate problem there is we're all just unwinding springs. We're all meat robots. There is no free will. There is no discretion on our part. Everything we think, everything we think we think, everything we think we think we think is merely, ultimately the product of blind chance. Blind chance that the universe exists in pantheism. Blind chance that our DNA is the way it is, and our circumstances are the way they are. And so your very question illustrates the difficulty of what is truth outside of theism. And this is one place where I believe his name is Saitan, really took a hit on Matt Dillahunty because even Matt Dillahunty couldn't really ground the idea of truth in anything but solipsism. So, for the theist, it's very convenient to say, yeah, it's God. God created the universe. God decided, the form of the universe, and God didn't stop by just the physical form. God also authored the moral laws, the philosophical laws, mathematical laws. All those things were consciously decided by God. And so for me, as a theist, it's very simple. Truth is God's will. God decided uh, that 1 + 1 = 2. God decided that murder is wrong. God decided that logic reveals truth. And so with this, we can move forward.
Okay. So you brought up a lot of things that either one could be a potential rabbit trail to go down. Instead of doing that, I'll try to start off a little slower. I think one of the things you mentioned at the very top was kind of like the questions present like these models of explanation, and apparently in your preference the theistic explanation makes more sense, right?
I mean,
Like
if you, yeah, that's
solipsism would have a problem of, well, you've got your truth which doesn't coincide with another person's personal truth, which would create a contradiction in
yeah,
itself. But then
it's
again,
not resolvable.
yeah, it. But the what you're pointing at there is the hard problem of solipsism, which I would say probably lean towards I'm an epistemic solipsist, meaning that I know what I know, but I don't know what you know. But I
Mm,
wouldn't say that I'm a metaphysical solipsist because that wouldn't make sense. There's only one truth as far as my opinion, right? Like there's only one truth. There's not my truth, your truth. There's one truth, but there's a truth that I know maybe about myself, which would probably be subjective things, right? Like I know how I feel when my back hurts, but I can't really prove that to my coworkers when I leave home early because my back hurts. They
mm,
could probably just say, "Hey, that's what you say, but how do I know that you're telling the truth?" So you've got a problem there. But I know to myself that my back hurts, just like I know I exist. Period. It's something that's undeniable, right? So
right?
in that sense, I guess I could say I'm an epistemic solipsist. But then the issue one might raise, we say, well, theism would make more sense because you know theism um, allows for free will, right? Or theism allows for certain things that you prefer to be true. But how do we know that that's true? Like it may feel like we have free will, but
Hmm.
we may not ultimately have free will. It may just feel that way because we're sort of catching up with our brain. Our brain's deciding things all in the background. And then upon reflection, we say, oh, that's why I did this because of this, that, and the other thing. We're storytellers telling each other stories. That's one possibility. I'm
Hmm.
not saying that free will doesn't exist or does, but I'm just saying that there's an alternative view there. And I think
Well, I
this
can
is
answer
what
that
I'm
easily.
getting at is that we're in order to really solve the problem and actually nail it down, we've got to have some kind of way to ground it, to say
Oh
that,
yeah.
hey, this is the truth. Like we can agree you're driving down the road in your car. You agree, I agree. We can see it on the camera. We could probably get witnesses that see you driving. There's all kinds of way to corroborate that
Right.
claim that you're driving down the road, right? And so
Right.
I would say that we may be a brain in a vat, we may be a matrix, you may not be driving anything. You may just be a brain in the vat in the matrix
Mhm.
somewhere.
Right.
That may be true. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's reasonable at least to think that you're driving down the road. I think that it's valid at least to
Okay.
say that based on empiricism and stuff like that. But with theism, do we have the same sort of evidence? Can we rise to that level of saying that some God, Christian God, any God, nebulous God, whatever kind of God you want to say it is that really come rise to the level of the same kind of evidence that we can point to as to you driving in your car? What do you
Well,
think?
Well, I can definitely answer both of those questions. We'll start off with the non-free will. We know that we are not determined because every system based on determinism ultimately fails. So the idea of determinism is we don't have free will. So we're just basically meat robots. Now, every system based on that doesn't work. So let's just take something very simple. Okay, this is morality. Okay, if we are determined, okay, if it is the case that we don't have free will, then it's then our circumstances are the product of, excuse me, judgments are the product of our circumstances, okay, and we're
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
interchangeable.
Right.
So no one is really guilty, no one is really innocent, no one is really successful, no one is really a failure,
Right.
no one is really a citizen, and no one is really a criminal. Um, and it's every system based on that has failed. Your subjective morality doesn't work. Now, if we did have free will, then we would expect that all moral systems would be more or less interchangeable. We would expect communism to do just as well as capitalism.
Okay.
We
Let
would
me stop you
expect
there. Why would that be the case? Why
communism
should
is
why like let me make myself a little more clear. Like why would um our preferred outcomes point to something true?
well because th- there's a very there's a couple of ways. I'm trying to think of the best way to answer. I think the best way to answer would be, um, believe it or not, what Scott Adams made a point about is if we live in a universe where no one has free will and no one, is really seeing reality for what it is, we have to go with the reality, so for lack of a better word, that makes the best predictions. Okay? So capitalism, theism, makes very good predictions. Okay, I know that winter is coming. I can predict the coming of winter, so I should store my nuts. Okay, so that's just, it's a person who does that. Basically the ant does better than the grasshopper. Um, so that's the easiest way to tell. So okay, so you look at communism. Communism predicts that if people's circumstances were equal, then you would have a flourishing utopia. Very, very simplified terms. If we change people's circumstances, we will change their decisions. And that is the prediction that made by communism, and that prediction has failed for 170 years.
I see. So you're looking at prediction. I love predictions because they do count as evidence, but I don't know if they count as proofs. Um, that's a whole different story. But yeah, truth are properties of claim. So I agree with you there. So it's like if you say, well, if this is true, then this is going to happen. Then when you put it to work and it doesn't happen, obviously it's not true. So
Well,
yeah, I agree that truth is basically the property of claims. So if your claim is that theism, what is the prediction on theism that proves it to be true? And when you say theism being true, we mean like I guess what I'm getting at is God the explanation for reality, or is God in reality, this supernatural kind of God, is it reality, right? So what prediction makes that true?
there you've basically answered the question already, and that is that both God and truth are abstract. Okay, I can't pick up a rock and say this is truth. I can't
Right.
hold truth in my hand. I can't, I can draw pictures of it. I can symbolize it. I can express it, but the actual stuff of truth is not of this world. So you've actually made the point that if God exists, truth exists. So you've actually come at it a different way. So again,
So
if truth exists, if there is this abstract thing that's not a concrete thing, then yes, abstract things exist, and one of those abstract things is God.
abstract things exist. What do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean exist? Like,
Well, the
I
easiest,
can imagine, I can conceptualize, or I can make an abstraction that of a universe farting unicorn, for lack of a better example.
that's not an
Um,
abstract. An abstract is something that's not going to be. There, the easiest way for most people to grasp the idea is with the concept of absolutes. First, last, all, none, every. So, for example, you're a normal person, and I say, okay, can you add something to everything? And you're a normal person, so you're going to say, no, you can't add something to everything because everything, that would mean everything is not everything. If everything is everything, you can't add something to it because there's no something that isn't already in everything. So, everything, the idea is something that exists but is definitely not concrete.
okay, so it sounds like what you're looking at is frame. You're defining a framework. So, like, explanations work within frameworks, right? So, I
Right?
guess, why should we accept the framework that theism rests on? Like, the framework for your explanation is that, the premise is that there's a God. God
Mhm.
exists. Without God, there is no truth. There is no possible, impossible. Nothing exists, because by definition, God accounts for all of that. By definition, therefore, it's true. But something seems to be lacking with that sort of argumentation. Is because it's almost like it's a baked-in assumption of that the framework you're using must be the one that everyone agrees on. Like, there's alternate explanations for the supernatural God hypothesis, like you had mentioned before. Like you could say the universe itself is eternal, and
Right?
it explains why we have the reality we observe because of the nature of reality. Everything has a nature. Even people talk about God having a nature. So when I say nature, I'm talking about the way things are, the way something is, a characteristic, or the way something is. So the universe has a way that it is, in many, 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 many infinite ways. It's a certain kind of way we can describe it, right? And this accounts for it. And you could say, well, that doesn't work, because how do you get who created the way it works? Who created the universe to work the way it works? Well, I could say the same thing about God. I could say, well, who created God to be the way he works? Well, God's eternal. God's always existing. So it's problem solved. But then you could say that the universe always existed, right? The universe is just eternal. And we know that there are eternal properties of the universe. So outside of space and time. So with this in mind, it seems like we're just kind of not grounding anything. We're just kind of like talking about preferences. You know what I mean? Does
No,
that make sense?
well, I understand what you're doing. We're comparing versions of theism. And of course, you are arguing the eternal universe, so we have to decide, is the ultimate source the cosmos, or is the ultimate source God? And as I covered before, you look around in the real world, and pantheism doesn't work. It doesn't explain free will. It has a lot of, it doesn't explain, um, you know, even how life evolved. It doesn't explain these things, and nor do the tools to understand them exist within that paradigm. It's from within a pantheistic paradigm. There is no way for you to go back and watch how life was evolved. There's no way, excuse me, came into being. There's no way for you to figure out why the universe is compatible with life. Fine tuned. These things, these questions are unanswerable. So on the one hand, if you're going to compare, okay, we're going to compare pantheism. We have a lot of questions that can't be answered. And if we go into theism, the questions have answers. So on a purely pragmatic level, theism wins.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that theism is simply kicking the can fallacy. So it's basically saying, well,
No.
pantheism, naturalism, or pantheism
Okay. Let me
would,
pause you right there.
um,
What
mhm.
doesn't God explain? Okay.
No, God explains everything,
Good.
and which is
And the
another
other
way of
one?
saying it explains nothing.
Well,
Because
no.
the reason I say that, which sounds kind of contradictory, but the reason I'm saying that is because any explanation that explains everything, like this armchair sort of philosophy, it's too easy. It's like saying, well, I've imagined this, universe farting unicorn, and it explains everything. And so, how does it not explain everything? Well, then you could say, well, who created the unicorn? Well, I could say, well, who created the God? Right? It's just kicking
Um,
the can, like the unicorn is kicking the can. God
no,
is
because
also sort of kicking the can.
you're actually contradicting yourself. You actually made 2 points. One of them is contradicting itself. Another one I'll address. Number one, if God is the explanation, okay, we'll just use the if for now, then God Himself requires no explanation. So, you're saying God explains it, and then you're saying, well, I don't understand God. No, God is the answer. Now that leads into the second point. Well, I don't understand God. Now that is an interesting question. You do not understand
Hmm.
God.
Hmm.
Okay, now when you say, what was it, purple unicorns or whatever, now this is a question of nomenclature versus definition. So if something answers the definition of God, it is God. So in the book of Isaiah, it's very clear that Ahura Mazda and the God of Abraham are the one and the same. They are called by different names, but it's very clear that we're talking about the same person. You know. Now, of course, the Abrahamic religions have a different take on God, but ultimately that's no different than people having different opinions of anyone. That's a problem of the observer and not the observed. Now, the other problem with the unicorn, the farting unicorn, or whatever we want to call
Well, it
it,
is a problem. I'm not disagreeing with you there. That's the reason I brought it up. It's what
is
I'm
that
saying is
if
it's
it
the
if
same
it doesn't
problem.
it doesn't if it doesn't answer the definition of God, then calling it God doesn't mean
Hmm.
anything. It's like forgive my language, but if I had a poop sandwich, I go, here you go, here's your grilled cheese. You're not going to eat it. I can
Right.
call it a grilled cheese. I can say, hey, this is a grilled cheese, but it doesn't fit the definition of a grilled cheese because there's
Right.
no cheese in it.
So now let me get this right. So you're saying it's a matter of semantics. So in other words, if the unicorn played the same role and did the same work as God, it's essentially just another name for God. It's what
Essentially.
you're basically, so you're making the pantheistic argument. Now you're saying that
No,
you
that's
can
not a
call God.
pantheist.
Well, hold on just a second, just so you understand what I mean. If someone is kind of like pantheism in this way, pantheism is doing the same work as your God's doing. It's just going one less step. Like the God is saying, no, God created reality, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
reality create reality. So you're kicking the can to God, but then by taking God outside of reality, you're creating more vagueness and something kind of not understood or even knowable, which you would probably go ahead and concede to. You'd probably say, well, nobody knows the mind of God or nobody understands the nature of God. Well, that's fine as an opinion, but it's not fine as like an absolute truth claim. And so if you're
Okay,
making the God as an
if
absolute, then it's a
okay,
problem.
you've made a couple of points, so let me address them before I start
Sure.
forgetting them.
Yep.
Okay, the number one point is pantheism is the idea that everything starts with the cosmos. Everything starts with matter and motion. Now, so no, I'm not arguing pantheism. I'm not arguing everything is God. I'm arguing that people have different names for God. They
Hmm.
use different words. They use different
Hmm.
terminology. You
Correct.
know, Now, the second thing, we already went over that, is that the pantheistic paradigm doesn't answer the question of free will, doesn't answer the question of truth, doesn't answer the question of the origin of everything. So it's, on a purely pragmatic, level, it's an insufficient explanation. It's like saying, where does food come from? It comes from the supermarket. It's like, no, we
Yeah,
know
I
that.
got you. But here's the
Now,
thing, though. Here's the problem. You're smuggling in free will as if it's a defeater.
because it is.
But that's your preference. There's like most philosophers don't even agree that free will is even a real thing. So that's not necessarily a defeater until we can prove that free will is really a thing, right? Like if you can prove it's a real thing, like the same way you can prove the sun, is in the skies where people can see it. Well, it seems like it's just your preference to say that we have free will. Like I say, there's a lot of arguments against free will. So it seems like you're smuggling in free will as a defeater when we haven't established that. We don't have any sound basis to determine whether free will actually exists ultimately. Um,
Okay.
and I'm saying that even as someone who may or may not believe in free will, like that's beside the point.
Mhm. Okay, well, I can address. I wanted to address one more point that you made earlier, and I don't know where people get this idea that God's nature is unfathomable. God is very rational, perfectly rational, and God is all-knowing. So for me, God is, for the most part, very easy to understand. Why would an all-good, all-knowing, all-perfect being do X? Like, oh, that's easy. God is easier to figure out than most people. But unfortunately, a lot of people have it in their head that, no, no, I can't figure out. God is unfathomable. No, you just, you know, figure it out. You just start with reason, goodness, and stuff like that. Now you've asked the question of free will. Okay. Now, we're going to start off on a very basic level with free will. The basic level of free will is the ability to choose correct from incorrect. Now that we're going to go from here, but this is the place to start. Okay? So, if we have free will, if free will exists, then we can choose. Okay, we can choose to do the correct thing. And this is as simple as going to school and studying, or working out before the big game, or not cheating on your wife, or you can choose, or 1 plus 1 equals. You choose to say two. You know, if we have free will, then we are genuinely acting of our own volition. We are autonomous. Now, if we do not have free will, then I cannot pronounce the word correctly, but it's heteronomous. It's the idea that our actions are not the product of anything really inside us. It's cold outside, and therefore I wear a jacket. My decision was caused by the weather. It's a very crude example, but it serves. So we look out into reality, and which is true. Do people choose their fate? Or is it chosen for them? And again, this goes back to what I said earlier, where all the systems that have been predicated on external causes have failed. I live in Los Angeles. I've seen it firsthand. You know, the entire government of the state of California is of the idea that if we change people's circumstances, they will be better people. If someone, doesn't like, if someone doesn't have a couch, we should get them a couch. And this is our approach to the homeless. We're just gonna give them stuff, and then they'll wake up and not be addicted to drugs.
Yeah, it
Um,
sounds like more preference here that you're talking about on that. But let me ask you this: is choice the same as free will? For example, if I'm
Hmm.
spraying a spider, if a spider detects me coming in the area with, and I go to spray the spider with, you know, repellent or whatever, and it chooses to run away, are you saying that spiders have free will?
Well, I would argue that spiders, you know, it's the difference between, okay, you want to talk about spiders, okay? Is there anything else in the world that spins a web? I can spin a web, but I'm not going to do it as well as a spider. Kind of the same thing. I would imagine that spiders essentially have no free will. For practical purposes, they have no free will. Their
But they choose.
responses, they don't choose. Their responses are 99.99% hardwired into them. When they encounter something, their biology kicks in and says, okay, something, over there is a bug, I will go eat it. That's not they don't decide to go eat it.
Aha.
They
So are
don't
you saying that
choose to
humans
go
are
eat
like
it.
spiders?
If there is no free will, then no, we're not making any choices. We're
But
not
maybe the
choosing
spider
either.
thinks he has free will.
I sincerely doubt it. I sincerely doubt it.
I'm
There's
just saying,
no.
I doubt a spider thinks about anything, but I'm just saying as an example, in the same way as a rough analogy, if a spider is working off of,
Instincts.
instincts or whatever the case may be, it could be that humans are acting on instincts, and because we're storytellers, we tell
Okay.
ourselves that we chose freely to eat when we were hungry. Maybe it was just a drive we had to eat, and we couldn't really help it. When we saw the food, we were really motivated to eat it, but because we were these storytellers, we kind of tell ourselves, well, we chose to eat the food, and so we construct this whole idea of free will. That seems possible, right? I mean, that's at least what neuroscientists tell us.
All right. Well, here's the thing. You can go down, but you can't go up. Okay? That's the easiest way for me to explain that. Okay. So let's say, for example, let's go in the other direction. This is easier to illustrate. Okay. So you have a person who has free will, and he's very hungry one day, so he eats. See, he can go down. He can go down. He can choose right. He can choose wrong. He can go down and say, "No, I'm hungry. I'm going to eat." The body compels me to. Um, but if there is no free will, you can't go up. The spider could not decide uh, not to build a web. I don't. Just some. The
Right,
dog.
right. I
The
understand that.
scorpion can't. The scorpion can't
Yeah,
choose
he's
not
restricted.
to
We're
swim.
restricted by our beingness. We're restricted. Like we can't fly, therefore we can't choose to fly. Therefore, that's not a defeater for free will. That's just a description of what is possible within our selection of choices. So, but we still have these choices to choose from. Like we can go to a restaurant and either choose the milkshake or the Coca-Cola, right? Um, right. So that's the choices that we can make. But what neuroscientists would tell you is that your brain has already decided before you were consciously aware of it what you were going to choose, right? And so that creates at least some major doubt that we have this ultimate free will. We might have the ability to choose, and we might have patterns that we've sort of been programmed into, whether that's from our genes or experiences or just repeating the same behavior over and over. We create these patterns, but that's not ultimate free will. But in either case, it seems like I don't know if pantheism is necessarily saying we have free will or not. It just says that we're going by nature. It seems like you're saying that pantheism's all about nature and nature's all about no free will. Therefore, pantheism can't be true. So it seems
That's
like you're arguing against nature. Are
okay.
you saying
Well,
that nature and science is wrong?
well, what I'm saying is there are different ways to interpret the same data, and that's one of the things that I debate about a lot. In the example that you gave, you very clearly made the choice that, okay, we have a phenomenon of decisions being made before we are consciously aware that decisions have been made. what are the interpretations of that data? There are
Yeah.
two interpretations of that data. Interpretation number one is that we have no free will. The decision was made by some biological natural component before we were even aware, and just as you said, our consciousness just sells it. Our consciousness is a press sector. Our decision making, our what we would think of as our decision making, is a post hoc rationalization. You know, Cain killed Abel, and then he figured out why. Um, the other way to interpret that data is that the decision is made by the soul, you know, and that our consciousness, our brain is receiving. As I've said a few times before,
Mm-hmm.
this is is consciousness to the brain what pumping blood is to the heart? That is, that consciousness is a function of the brain, or is it the case that that consciousness is to the brain what sound is to the ear? That our brain is basically a biological antenna that receives our consciousness from a higher source.
Or it's reasonable to ascertain that there may be an explanation that comes in the future that doesn't entail either of those. In other words, we have a history and we have a long history of questions being answered out of the box. Like we usually dichotomize, we have a dichotomy of choices that can explain a particular phenomenon, but then we come to realize all those things were wrong, that actually it's this explanation that we didn't even think about that was the explanation. So
There are
that
there are
could that be possible?
there are two things I want to address there. Number one, uh, theism, like you said, explains it. Okay, so it is a complete explanation. Now, you're also arguing that potentially in the future there's a better explanation than theism that we haven't thought of yet. I'll entertain that possibility. I'll entertain it. However, I find the I don't know answer to be absolutely wrong. Okay, I've covered this a number of times because specifically it's not objective. Okay,
But
and
is there a track
it
record of that?
all of what?
Of something we didn't know actually being the case?
Yes, of course that's happened.
Okay, so how is
Okay.
it? How is that a
However,
bad? How is that? How is it unreasonable to think that that's something that
okay,
is plausible,
all
not
right.
just possible, but plausible?
Well, it's not plausible because, like I said, theism explains it very succinctly. We might, in the future, come to know the actual mechanics, the actual phenomenology of it. But we know right now that we have free will. It is the product of the soul. It is a product of our relationship with God. People consciously or unconsciously sever that connection and they turn into meat robots. Now, to get to the more important point, is this idea of I don't know. That I don't like the answer, I don't like where all the evidence points, but I'm not going to concede, so I'm just going to say I don't know. Now the big problem there is because it is subjective. Okay, so when I discuss this, the objective is God exists, or the objective is God does not exist. Those are your two options:
Binary,
exist or
yeah.
does not exist.
Hmm.
Now, when someone says, well, I don't know, or I'm not convinced, or I'm not sure, anything like that, they're not actually answering the question in reality. They're talking about their feelings. They're talking about their subjective answer. They're talking about their
That goes
personal
both
truth.
ways. In other words, it goes back to the poop sandwich thing. We can call God, um, you know, Yahweh, or we can call God the universe, the laws of nature. It's all the same thing. That's where, you
Well,
know,
no, because
it's
we are
never a
referring to two
defeater.
different things. We are referring
Well,
to
it's
two different things. What in theism, what I'm calling God, is a timeless, spaceless, all perfect creator of the cosmos. When you're saying God, you're saying the cosmos. So we are not talking about the same thing. You're talking about the pantheistic
How are they
God
different
versus,
again?
well, we've gone over, for example, the pantheism does not support free will. It's not reconcilable with free will.
But you
So we're
say
talking
that,
about very,
but you said you have to stop you because you're saying that, and I'm telling you that free will maybe works under pantheism. How does free will not work under pantheism? I don't understand.
okay, so what you're
And I'm
doing,
not saying that free will exists, by the way, because you're
now,
kind of using free will as a defeater again, and I'm still not convinced that free will is the defeater you think it is. I still haven't connected that yet, because you're just
okay,
saying
well,
that, well, without free will, people would have no, there would be no justice. People would not have accountability if they're okay. Fine, I grant you all that, but how does that preference defeat pantheism or no God? Or I'm not sure how what the point is there.
okay, so now the first thing I want to address with what you said is is you're not is it's a rejection of logic and evidence. Okay, so we have a situation where all the evidence and all the reason points towards theism and free will, theism because free will. But we've got people who say, well, I'm going to ignore all that. I'm going to say I don't know, or I'm going to ignore everything that was said, and I'm going to believe in solipsism anyway. I'm going to believe in nihilism anyway, because future philosophers will figure it out. And this was the tragic story of my first philosophy professor, whom I respect to this day. I'm pretty sure he's passed on by now, but I deeply respected him, and he was an atheist. And at the time, it was very easy for him to believe future generations will be able to reconcile atheism and free will. And so he believed as an atheist in free will, even though he was very well aware that he could not justify it. He could not reconcile free will and atheism, but he knew how important free will was. And I want to make that absolutely clear. Now, the second thing that you're going on about is how this ties into free will. And the answer I've reiterated is things don't work without free will. They don't work on a practical level, and they don't work on an abstract level. They don't work on a practical level because every system that's been created, predicated on determinism, has failed spectacularly. So. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people have died in pursuit of this idea that no, humans don't have free will. On an abstract level, without free will, you can't do philosophy. So even just asking the question and hoping to come to an answer presupposes free will. So again, you run into that. And again, you cannot reconcile you cannot reconcile you cannot reconcile free will with any paradigm outside of theism. That's just reality.
Okay, you're asserting that. I get it. I understand why you're saying it. That the consequences of doing so are bad, right? In your view. So
Well, they're bad on a
even if
practical level
I
and an
guess well
unworkable
on a
level
right
on.
and on a practical level, but I'm just saying that even if I were to grant you that on a practical level these beliefs lead to bad consequences, that goes into consequential fallacy. That people who argue that bad consequences equal untruth, not necessarily. There's a lot of truth. I think that what that really points to is that we have feelings as people, and we have preferences. We feel
I
like
know
we want
you're
we
kind of
want certain things
arguing.
true because the consequences are what we feel we want them to be, right? And that's understandable. I get what you're saying. It leads to bad consequence if I was to grant that, right? But that doesn't in any way tell me that it's true or not. Either way, I'm still not connecting that. I think that at best we can say that you have a preference that it be this way, and that it might be possible that free will is actually a thing. And since it's possible that it could be a thing, and then you also like the preference that it gives you, therefore it must be true. I don't think that really adds up, though. I'm just not convinced.
Um, well, not being convinced is a subjective statement. Okay.
True,
Uh,
true, very
I'm not.
true, very true.
Okay.
All
You
of
know
that
what?
is, yeah.
John F.
You're not
Kennedy comes.
convinced of pantheism, and that's a subjective thing. I agree.
I am no. I am certain that pantheism is not true. It's not me subjectively. Now, now, when you say I'm not convinced, you know, that is. Are you saying that you have any strong arguments? Now, the question, of
Yes,
course.
yes, there's strong arguments for why free will may not in fact be the case, because we have a whole scientific field that has studied that and that has concluded thus far that free will is not really a thing. That's the number one point. Also, we have logic. Um, that would violate cause and effect. If we have free will, that means we can violate cause and effect. No, we can't. We're in a causal chain. Our decisions are a result of things that preceded us. We respond to things one way or the other. So ultimately, what grounds our choices are those things that preceded us, including the way we feel about things and including what we want. Like, we can't choose what we want ever. We can only we can only try to make choices that are coherent with what we want, but we can't choose what we want, and therefore we have some form of will, we have volition, we have choices, but we don't have this ultimate free will, because that would violate the chain of cause and effect. But
All right. Now, if I may, I can. That's a point that's been made before,
mhm,
and the easiest way to address it is that you're ignoring the present and you're ignoring the future. Now, when I make a decision, a good chunk of my decision making is how will this work out in the future,
mhm,
next year, the year after, 10 years from now. So, what you're really doing is you're trying to equate um, consequence with sequence. Okay. So the other thing you were arguing is that something cannot work and be true, and I don't really cleave to that idea. I don't. If something is true, it works, and this is as simple. This is as simple as the movie Oppenheimer. This is as simple as E equals mc squared. It's true, and it works. Now, if it
but
didn't work, then it wouldn't be true.
but when you're saying works, I think you mean it in two different ways at the same time, which is can be kind of confusing. So, like, if you say E equals mc square, it works in the sense that it's made predictions that came through and were
Mhm.
verified and repeated. So in that way, the theory works. But then you also talk about Oppenheimer, where you say, well, because people did this thing or that thing, or you could even make it simpler than that. People behave a certain way. It's going to lead to these consequences. We see these consequences. They feel bad to us. Therefore, they must not be true. But that, again, that's just, that's kind of like confusing truth claims, like properties of claims or properties of comments or statements, with theory, like evidence. So I just want to be clear what you mean by works. Like, if something works, do you mean like, because I know that you said we know something is true if we can make a prediction and it follows a pattern consistently. But
Right.
those, but then even there, you still that may not hold in a different part. Like if here, I'm gonna make a prediction. If I let go of this phone, it's gonna fall out of my hand and fall on me. Boom. That's exactly what happened. I can do this over and over and over. So I can say gravity is true, or I can say letting go of the phone when I hold it up is true. But guess what? If I go to the moon and I let
Hmm.
go of my phone, it might not fall. It might just float away, right? So it just depends on the context. It depends on other factors. And so, you know what I mean? Like, so even that particular thing, it only works within a framework. And so I guess what I'm getting at is you're grounding theism in a framework. What I'm saying is, why should we, what are you grounding the framework in?
I've explained it.
No, I mean, you've explained what you believe is what I'm getting at. But I don't see, like, if we look at some of the comments here, everybody's asking the same thing over and over. So, and I'm just repeating it, like, you're definitely explaining things. God explains everything. I'm not even going to lie to you. God explains absolutely everything perfectly. Boom. No need to learn anything. No need to investigate any further or question any further. There's no room for doubt. There's no reason to wonder. God explains everything.
No, we
But
seek to understand God better. You know, you
well,
asked,
yeah,
you
yeah,
made the you made
exactly.
the question.
Well, yeah, of course it
You
explains
made
better because God is by definition that thing that explains everything perfectly. So yeah, it's gonna by definition it explains things perfectly
the more
and
we
better than
understand
any other
God, the better things
explanation.
are.
Right, but that's only by a particular framework. Like, for example, I can give you I'll give you an alternative framework. Let's take science. In science, God is not a good explanation. God is a horrible explanation because God can't be tested in the lab. It can't be looked at under a microscope. God can't be looked at that way. And so, under the framework of science, it doesn't
Mhm.
work, right? So, it just depends on the
Uh,
framework. You know what I
I
mean?
Now I can address that. That's called scientism, and scientism is self-refuting because scientism states that all questions can be answered in a lab,
No, 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 no,
and
no, no,
the
no, 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 no,
state.
no, 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 no. You misunderstand what I mean. That's you're describing scientism. Fine, perfect. I'm talking about science, not scientism. Science isn't designed. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The framework of science is not designed to explain the whys in everything. Like it explains behavior. This is why scientism is wrong because real science explains how things behave. Like it can tell you why this falls. This explains you know the speed at which it falls, under what condition my phone falls when I let it go, as opposed to being on the moon where if I let this go it doesn't do the same thing. It describes behavior is in much detail as possible, but it can never address the ontological explanations for things. That's where metaphysics comes in. So metaphysically, God works as an explanation. But in science, is not metaphysics. Science is just a description of how things behave, right?
All right. Well, you've admitted the inadequacy of science, that it doesn't answer all questions.
Right. That's right. That's
So,
right.
if, if you want to answer questions that science cannot answer, you have to look to something else.
Metaphysics. Metaphysics. But this is what I'm getting at. Right now, metaphysics, we don't know a way to we really do not know a way, whether in metaphysics, philosophy, how to ground soundly things, metaphysical explanations. We can't ground them soundly. You know what I mean? Like sound meaning concrete. Like in science, science can say, well, we can ground soundly why something behaves a certain way. It can describe exactly what happens, repeat it, verify it,
Um,
observe it
I've,
objectively.
I've, I've, I've,
Metaphysics, though,
I've,
is kind of
I've gone
like a
over.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I've spent an hour going over the practical aspects. We can
Yes,
look
you have,
around us.
and I agree.
So it
I
is. It
agree.
is. So theism there is very grounded.
Grounded in what?
Grounded in the real world. I've spent an hour explaining to you how theism works on a practical level, and non-theism doesn't work.
Right, and I've addressed every point, and I guess this is where
No, you
I guess
haven't.
we just kind of agree to disagree because you're saying that, well, the consequence so far, what I got it, and let me know if I'm wrong, correct me,
Mhm.
but I think that you're grounding the grounding that you're pointing to is consequences, and what was the other thing that you mentioned? Um, Explanations and consequences. That's what it is. So there's a
Okay,
perfect explanation, but it's also verified by the consequences, right?
right. And so we have some very good grounding. Very good.
I don't think so. That's
Because,
debatable because
okay,
it doesn't matter if it's practical. Like if something is impractical, it can still be
okay, see
true.
now you're arguing that things are true even if they don't work. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
yes, that's a truth. Hey,
No,
um, flat
you
Earth
know,
works. The idea of the flat Earth, people have been using that flat Earth paradigm for years. And so when we measure certain distances on the world, but as we expand out, it no longer works. That's what I'm getting at. No longer works. It depends
okay,
on your framework. If your
okay. So
framework
if you,
changes, then those
okay,
explanations fall away.
wait. Okay, you're saying flat Earth works, okay? And right now everyone believes that, not everyone, but I'm saying the overwhelming majority believe the Earth is a sphere. Now, if you
Hmm.
have some compelling evidence to the contrary, great, I will be happy to listen to it. But currently, the compelling evidence is I don't believe you. Now, we're going
The
on an
compelling
hour.
evidence is you don't believe me. I don't
No,
understand. So I'm
that's
not
what you're
arguing
telling
for a
me.
flat Earth. What I'm saying is, what
You're saying
I'm
theism
saying,
works, and it's very
yeah.
theism works, and it's grounded. But you know what? I reserve the right to believe something that doesn't work and isn't grounded, and that's not rational.
No, no, no,
Sorry.
no, 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 no. That's not what I'm saying, though,
Yeah, that
Alejandro.
is what you're saying.
It's
That's
not what I'm
exactly what
saying.
you're saying.
It's not what I'm
Okay,
saying at all.
okay. If
I'm saying that there's certain things that we simply don't know, right?
okay,
Like
what don't we know?
like this whole free will question. This is all
How
based
do
on
you? I've
preferences.
I've
We have
explained it
evidence
to
to
you.
refute free will. We have
No,
evidence
we
to
haven't.
support.
No.
Hold
We
on,
have
hold on.
ev-
Just let me get my point across first. All I'm saying is that we have evidence that refutes free will,
It does
scientific
not
evidence.
refute
Under
free
that
will.
under that framework, there
Okay,
is evidence.
I'm explaining to you that there are. It doesn't refute it because there are different ways to interpret the data.
Right, exactly. There's
Okay,
different ways. I agree with you. There's different ways to
so
interpret
it is
that
not.
data,
Science does not
but that
refute
data
free will.
counts as evidence
Your
when you can make predictions. If you
the
can
interpret.
predict, hey,
Yes.
if I showed you, suppose I did this, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
If I could come up with a way to predict under no free will that this thing or that thing would happen, right? Would that count as evidence to you? Because it does for science. Science uses prediction as evidence. So if scientists can say, look, I can prove free will doesn't exist, I'll shock their brain in this particular section of their brain, it'll make their arm go up without any intervention of thought.
That
I can
that will.
shock their brain in this one and make them see red without
Okay.
any conscious thought, right? That would
Mm,
disprove free will.
okay. No. All right. It works under both interpretations. Now, again, it is not that the data refutes free will. Your interpretation of the data is that it refutes free will. You have an interpretation. Now, the second point is that it works under both interpretations. If the brain produces consciousness, then fiddling with the brain is going to affect consciousness. If the brain receives consciousness, then fiddling with the brain will affect consciousness.
Yes, under that framework, exactly. The same evidence, the same or not evidence, the same predictions can support both. But what I'm saying is until you can show this outside the brain thing, then you don't have any grounding, sound grounding. You just have an explanation. Like we
No,
know the brain exists.
I've
We know that the
literally gone.
shock and the triggers exist. We know those particles exist. We know
Okay,
these
okay,
things exist. That makes for a good hypothesis or a good theory. But
okay.
when you
Look,
start
I've answered your
introducing
questions.
these,
I've
hold on, I'm
answered
not
your.
done, Alejandro. I'm not done talking, man. When you introduce these unknown variables as possible explanations, great, they're great, but they're not sound evidence for anything. They're just philosophical, imaginary things. That's what I'm getting
Okay,
at is that you're
all right.
introducing explanations that are imaginary.
They're not imaginary because they're work. You were just. The thing is, you're trying to argue an interpretation of the data, and that interpretation of the data doesn't work. Now
But
I've
you said
answered
the
all your
soul.
questions.
Show me, okay, show me the soundly where the soul exists. What is it made of?
Oh, okay, is this made of the same stuff that truth is made of? We went over
Okay,
that.
so
So
it's
look,
an it's imaginary.
it's abstract, not imaginary.
They're
Now,
both the same category, Alejandro.
no, they're not. No, they're not. They're very
Abstractions
different.
are imaginary. I promise you. In the book
No.
of, in philosophy, in our books of philosophy, abstractions describe imaginary things, concepts, abstractions, things you think up. I mean,
Okay.
whether they can are coherent within a framework, it's fine. They can be, but they're still imaginary.
No,
It's
they're not.
just like multiverse stuff.
Imagine, imagine if
It's
something
just
is
like
imaginary.
any other model that scientists put forth. They're imaginary until they can actually produce some testable predictions that can show that they're real. That's what I'm
Okay.
saying. The sound grounding.
Okay. 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 First of all, start making one point at a time because you tend to make three or four, and I have to address all of them. Make one point at a time. Number two, I've answered all your questions, so I'm ready to conclude. But you raised a point I will address, and that's it. Okay? Now, the difference between abstract and imaginary is imaginary things we make up, and abstract things are things we perceive. Okay? So I perceive first. I perceive truth. I didn't imagine a straight line. I perceived a straight line. So they're very different. So that's the last question I'm going to answer because I'm answering a question several times. You keep running around and trying to do it again. And it's been an hour. Thank you very much. Now, if
Yeah,
any of
yeah,
your
yeah, yeah.
members of your
Don't.
audience,
Hey, Alejandro. Of course, sometimes we're going to disagree or we don't really see eye to eye or understand, but it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate you coming on and taking the time to have the conversation because I'd rather do it this way than back and forth, through the comment sections and stuff. And plus, it gives the audience a chance to kind of have something interesting to listen to at the same time. So I appreciate you, man. And I love you. I don't have any disagreement with what you believe in. What you believe in, I would say, is could 100% be true for all I know. That's really not what I'm against here or arguing against or whatever. Just challenging you, just trying to challenge you in every way I can think of imaginary. But guys, thank you for joining us. Alejandro has to go. Um, if anyone wants to jump in, jump in. I've got a few minutes here. If you want to join in while Alejandro needs to go take care of his business, I'm sure he's home and it looks dark over there already. So I'm gonna let him go. And And we'll conclude until next time. We're going to try to do this again, Alejandro, on
Absolutely.
Sunday. I have another person coming in that wants
Yeah.
to challenge and do stuff. He's a Christian. Hopefully,
Hmm.
he'll be able to make it on Sunday. But
Okay.
so if you want to jump in Sunday, if you have the time, let me know
I'll see
and
what
we
my
can do it.
schedule is, and I'll get to you. Okay.
Okay, sounds good, man.
Take
You
care.
have a good night, brother. I appreciate you, man.
Take care, brother.
All right, man. Bye bye. All right, guys. So that was Mr. Alejandro. Um, but if anybody wants to jump in and kind of talk about it, but the thing about it is, the issue I had was that I don't know, am I missing something? Because I thought he was just kind of re-explaining the same thing over and over, like repeating, like he kept smuggling in free will as a defeater for any other explanation besides theism. Which, number one, as far as I know, solipsism and pantheism say nothing about whether free will is true or not. I might be wrong, but I don't think so. I do know that most scientists don't, that study free will, don't think that there's a lot of evidence to support it. But this doesn't mean that means nature or pantheism doesn't support it. I mean, it could just be. I mean, and then there's pantheists that do believe in free will. I mean, I don't think that has anything to do with it. So I'm not sure what that means. Um, and then this consequentialism. He's conflating. If the consequences are bad, then that proves it's not true. Not necessarily, right? I mean, am I crazy here? But yeah, and yeah, Logan says the soul is even more problem. Yeah, it is. It's almost like kicking the can. It's like saying, well, consciousness can't explain. The brain can't explain consciousness, but we can kick the can to this other imaginary thing called the soul that we have no evidence for, but it creates a perfect explanation for everything. Again, I don't know how that helps the situation. I mean, it gives us a great explanation, maybe, if you believe in those sort of things, but scientifically, I don't think there's any evidence for the soul. I don't think metaphysically we have any evidence for the soul. In fact, I think metaphysically, the soul is still a problem because it's dualism, and dualism leads to all sorts of problems, right? So I don't think these things are as clear as Alejandro is painting it out to be. I think he's just pretty much reiterating his opinion and his preferences for what he wants to believe is true, which I find is pretty much the case with a lot of theists. But yeah, if anybody wants to jump in and discuss it with me, we can. But if not, I'll go ahead and close out the show. But yeah, I appreciate the time that you joining me. It was a lot of fun. And again, like I said, Sunday we're going to have someone else on, a Christian, who's going to talk about his beliefs, which are a little bit different, a little heretical from your mainstream Christianity. He'll be discussing his beliefs, and we'll discuss it as well in the same sort of way. But yeah, so join me on Sunday, and we'll meet you guys back at that time. So, anyways, good night, everybody. I appreciate you. Talk to you soon. Bye bye. Yeah, that's going to be probably 8 o'clock, 8 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday. So 8 p.m. Eastern time, Logan asked. So, anyways, guys, good night. Have a good one, and we will see you then.